There is a building on High Street in New Haven, Connecticut, that has no windows on its lower floors. It sits back from the pavement behind a low stone wall, its face a kind of brownstone blankness. No nameplate, no sign, no concession to curiosity, offering the street nothing but the dull authority of its own opacity. Students at Yale University walk past it every year, sometimes for 4 years, before the thought occurs to ask what it is. When they finally ask, the answer is brief enough to close the question for most of them. It is called the Tomb, and it belongs to an organization called Skull and Bones. The building was completed in 1856, designed in the Egyptian Revival style that mid-century America associated with permanence and the afterlife, its severe geometry suggesting simultaneously a mausoleum, a counting house, and a fortress. The exterior carries a single recurring emblem, a human skull above 2 crossed bones, with the number 322 set beneath it. That number appears on the padlocks that secure the doors, on the woodwork inside, on documents the Society has long considered its most private possessions. For most of the organization's history, no one outside the initiated membership was supposed to know what 322 meant. For most of that history, no one did. But silence, it turns out, is a kind of pressure, and pressure, applied long enough, eventually finds its seam. Skull and Bones is the oldest, and by most measures the most influential of Yale's secret senior societies. It was founded in 1832, which means it has been meeting in some form for nearly 2 centuries, selecting 15 new members every year from the graduating senior class, tapping them in the society's language, inducting them into rituals that have remained, remarkably, largely secret, and then releasing them into American public life, carrying something that is difficult to name precisely: a shared experience, a set of relationships, and a tradition of mutual support that has produced an extraordinary density of senators, cabinet members, intelligence directors, federal judges, and presidents. 2 members of Skull and Bones ran against each other for the presidency of the United States in 2004. Both of them, when pressed by interviewers, declined to discuss it. That is the known part. The question that has animated researchers, journalists, and a great many people who distrust concentrated power is what exactly that shared experience consists of, what obligations it creates, and whether an organization that has reliably populated the most sensitive offices in American government for nearly 2 centuries represents merely the persistence of old boy networking, or something more deliberate, more structured, and more consequential than networking alone. The record is not simple. It is not simple in either direction. William Huntington Russell returned from a period of study in Germany in the early 1830s, with, among other things, a plan. He had been a student at Göttingen, one of the great German research universities of the era, where secret student societies, Verbindungen, had been a feature of academic life for generations, organized around oath-bound brotherhood, philosophical ritual, and the kind of intense intellectual and personal loyalty that comes from shared initiation. Russell brought that model back to New Haven, and in 1832 he co-founded, with Alphonso Taft and 13 other members of the Yale class of 1833, the society that would eventually be known as Skull and Bones. The founding story contains an earlier rupture. Russell and Taft had both been members of Phi Beta Kappa, then still operating as a secret society rather than the academic honor society it later became. According to the version of events that circulated in early accounts of the organization, Russell felt he had been passed over for a leadership position in that society, or believed that its leadership had been unfairly allocated. The details shift depending on the source, and the full record of the quarrel has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What is clear is that Russell and his associates chose to create a new organization rather than compete within an existing one. The decision to establish a rival society rather than reform the one they had says something about the founder's temperament that would become characteristic of the institution. When Bones made a decision, it made it finally, and it built structures that were meant to last. The question of what exactly Russell imported from Germany is one that the scholarly record has never fully settled, and it deserves more care than it usually receives. The historian and researcher Anthony Sutton, working primarily from documents he identified as having been removed from the tomb in the early 1980s, documents that appeared in photographic reproduction in the volume he edited with Charlotte Iserbyt, argued that Skull and Bones was essentially the American chapter of a German secret order, a claim that, if true, would mean the society was always something more like a franchise than an independent invention. Sutton identified the parent body as a philosophical society operating in the German idealist tradition, with ties to the Hegelian philosophy that was then at the height of its influence at German universities. The Hegelian connection, in Sutton's reading, was not incidental. The dialectical view of history as a conflict between thesis and antithesis resolved into synthesis provided, he argued, a philosophical framework that explained the society's later willingness to support apparently contradictory political positions when institutional interests demanded flexibility. This argument has been repeated often and with considerable confidence in popular accounts of the society. It requires some care. Sutton's core contention that Russell's founding drew on a German model is plausible and consistent with what we know about German university culture in the 1830s and about the intellectual milieu Russell moved in at Göttingen. That part of the story has the texture of the credible. The stronger form of the claim, that Skull and Bones was formally chartered as a subordinate chapter of a specific German order, carrying explicit obligations to a parent body overseas, is harder to establish. The documents Sutton worked from were of contested provenance, their authenticity questioned by members of the society and by scholars who were skeptical that the materials had been obtained or interpreted correctly. The claim is not impossible. It is not proven. What the Society's own internal records appear to show, based on accounts from those who have seen them, including journalists who gained access in the 1970s and 1980s, is more modest and more interesting. The records reference, with evident reverence, the death of Demosthenes in 322 BC. The Athenian orator and statesman took his own life, rather than surrender to the Macedonian forces pursuing him after the failure of the rebellion he had advocated. A man who chose death over capitulation, whose voice had been the most eloquent and the most insistent argument for Athenian freedom, and who died alone on a small island in an act of deliberate self-extinction. The Society seems to have taken 322 as a year of mourning and founding simultaneously, the year their patron's voice was silenced and the year from which they would count their own beginning. That is one reading of 322. It is the reading that appears to have internal documentary support within the Society's own papers. The competing reading, that 322 is a chapter number designating Skull and Bones as chapter 322 of a German parent order, is the reading that has the more elaborate scholarly apparatus built around it, chiefly by Sutton, but it is the reading that rests on the more contested evidentiary base. Both theories may, in principle, be true simultaneously. An organization can name itself with a number that carries more than one layer of meaning. The honest position is that the question is genuinely contested, that the evidential threads point in different directions, and that anyone who tells you the answer is settled is telling you more than the record supports. What is not contested is what the founders built. The Russell Trust Association was incorporated in 1856, the same year the tomb was completed, as the legal and financial entity that would hold the Society's assets in perpetuity. This was not a casual decision. Incorporating a trust to hold property meant that Skull and Bones was building for generations rather than cohorts, creating an institutional structure that would survive the deaths of every founding member and every subsequent member, a legal body that could own real estate, accumulate capital, and make long-term investments in the Society's permanence. Most college fraternities of the period were informal, dependent on the energy of their current membership, and they rose and fell accordingly. Skull and Bones was not built like a fraternity. It was built like a dynasty. The tomb itself is the most visible evidence of that ambition. Designed in a period when Egyptian revival architecture carried connotations of the eternal, it was the same stylistic register chosen for mausoleums and for the facades of banks, two institutions that dealt in permanence. The building was constructed on land that Yale would never own. The Russell Trust holds the property. Yale students walk past it. Yale administrators walk past it. The university itself has no legal claim to the structure that sits within its campus boundaries, and for much of the society's history, has had no knowledge of what the structure contains. What it contains has been pieced together slowly from a combination of former members who broke silence, journalists who found ways in, and the occasional document that made its way into the public record. The interior of the tomb includes meeting rooms decorated with trophies and relics of an unusual character, human skulls, allegedly including the skull of Geronimo, the Apache leader, which a group of bonesmen reportedly removed from its burial site at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, during the First World War. The claim has been disputed by the society and confirmed by some documentary evidence, and it became the subject of a legal action by Geronimo's descendants in the early 2000s. Whether the skull in the tomb is truly Geronimo's, or whether it is one of the society's many pieces of theatrical morbidity, has never been definitively established. The descendants' lawsuit was ultimately dismissed on procedural grounds without a factual finding either way. The society's relationship to human remains, real and symbolic, is not coincidental. Death is the organizing metaphor of skull and bones in a way that distinguishes it from nearly every other elite society in American institutional history. The initiation ritual, as described by former members and corroborated by journalists who have gathered accounts from multiple independent sources, takes place in the tomb over a single night in spring when the senior class is being prepared to leave Yale for what the society calls the barbarian world, meaning everything outside the tomb's walls. The initiate is brought into a space designed to confront him, and eventually her, with symbolic mortality, a mock coffin, an encounter staged as a confrontation with death, and, at the center of the ceremony, the requirement to lie in a coffin and narrate one's complete sexual history to the assembled membership. This last element has been reported consistently enough, and by enough independent sources, that it has attained the status of reasonable certainty rather than rumor. Former members who have broken the society's oath of secrecy, and a number have, though never comfortably, describe the sexual confession as the ceremony's most psychologically charged moment, a deliberate act of vulnerability engineering. By extracting the most private information a person possesses and depositing it with 15 peers, the ritual creates a bond whose substrate is mutual exposure. This is a sophisticated mechanism. It is also a very old one. The technique of using shared secret knowledge, specifically knowledge that would be damaging if released, as the glue of institutional loyalty, appears across a wide range of fraternal and initiatory traditions. What makes the Skull and Bones version distinctive is the specificity of the information demanded, the seriousness with which the confessional is conducted, and the social stakes. These are not anonymous strangers in a lodge. They are classmates who will scatter into careers in law, finance, government, and intelligence, and who will carry the knowledge of each other's confessions for the rest of their professional lives. The effect is not merely to create friendship, it is to create mutual accountability of a very particular kind, a web of shared vulnerability that binds the cohort more tightly than any oath sworn over a symbol could. Other elements of the initiation have been described with varying degrees of consistency across different accounts. Theatrical presentations referencing death and resurrection, the assumption of pseudonyms that members use exclusively within Skull and Bones contexts, and a closing ceremony in which the new members are formally welcomed into a community that styles itself as lying outside and above the ordinary categories of institutional life. These pseudonyms, called Bones names, are assigned rather than chosen, and they follow patterns that have been partially decoded by outsiders. One member of each cohort typically receives the name Magog, traditionally assigned to the member who claims the most extensive prior sexual experience, while another receives GOG. George Herbert Walker Bush was reportedly given the name Magog. Whether this is accurate cannot be independently confirmed. What can be confirmed is the physical scale of the institution the society built to support its members beyond Yale. The Deer Island Retreat, a property in the St. Lawrence River held by the Russell Trust, provides a private space for Bones alumni gatherings, a place where the initiated can meet in seclusion without the pretense of the campus setting. The existence of such a property, dedicated, maintained, and held in legal trust across generations, is evidence of an organization that takes its own continuity with the utmost seriousness, an organization that is not merely a college club that grows nostalgic at reunions, but an institution that invests materially in keeping its members in sustained relationship with one another throughout their lives. That investment has by any measure produced returns. Alphonso Taft, one of the two principal founders, became Secretary of War and Attorney General of the United States under President Ulysses Grant and served as ambassador to Austria-Hungary and then to Russia. His son William Howard Taft became the 27th President of the United States and subsequently Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person in American history to hold both offices. William Howard Taft was a bonesman. His son Robert Taft, a dominant figure in mid-century Republican politics and a repeated contender for the presidential nomination, was a bonesman. The Taft family's relationship to Skull and Bones extended across 3 generations and 2 of the 3 branches of the federal government. This is not coincidence of the ordinary kind. Henry Stimson, who served as Secretary of War under both William Howard Taft and Franklin Roosevelt, and who was one of the architects of American military policy in the Second World War, including the decision to deploy atomic weapons against Japan, was a bonesman. McGeorge Bundy, who served as National Security Advisor under Kennedy and Johnson and shaped American policy during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, was a bonesman. His brother William Bundy, who played a significant role in escalating American involvement in Vietnam while serving in the State Department, was a bonesman. The concentration of bonesmen in the national security apparatus of the United States in the mid-20th century is, whatever one makes of it, a documented fact rather than a speculative one. The Central Intelligence Agency's relationship to Skull and Bones has been the subject of sustained scholarly and journalistic attention, and here the evidence is less clean but still suggestive. The CIA's predecessor organization, the Office of Strategic Services, was founded under William J. Donovan and staffed heavily from the Yale-trained Eastern Establishment elite, of which Skull and Bones was the inner sanctum. Several of the CIA's most consequential early officers were bonesmen or had close personal connections to the network. The precise degree to which membership in the society shaped recruitment, promotion, or operational decisions within the intelligence community is not fully documented. The relevant files remain classified or have been destroyed. But the overlap between the Bones Network and the early CIA has been remarked upon by enough serious historians that it cannot be dismissed as pattern-seeking. The most intellectually honest framing of this overlap may be the simplest one. People who went to Yale in the mid-20th century, and particularly people who were tapped by the most selective of Yale's senior societies, constituted a small and intensely networked elite from which the American national security establishment drew heavily because that establishment was itself built by people who valued exactly the credentials and relationships that Skull and Bones exemplified. Whether the causation runs from Bones membership to career success or from pre-existing social position to both Bones membership and career success is a question that cannot be resolved from the outside, and the people who know the answer are not, as a general rule, willing to discuss it. This is where the story of Skull and Bones becomes genuinely complicated and where the popular account, the account circulated in paperbacks, documentaries, and the wilder precincts of the internet, tends to make its most serious errors. The popular account assumes that because Skull and Bones has produced so many powerful people, it must therefore control them. The historical record suggests something more nuanced and in some ways more troubling than control. It suggests that what Skull and Bones actually produces is familiarity, and that in an institutional culture where decisions about hiring, promotion, policy, and patronage are made by people who know each other, familiarity is a form of power whose effects are real and cumulative, even when no conspiracy is present. But before examining what the society has meant in practice, it is worth understanding what it has looked like in practice, from the inside, as reported by the people who have been willing to describe it. Ron Rosenbaum is the journalist who cracked the story open. Writing first for Esquire in 1977 and then returning to the subject in a longer and more deeply researched piece for The Atlantic in May 2000, Rosenbaum produced what remains the most sustained and credible journalism ever done on the internal life of Skull and Bones. He did not break into the tomb, though he spent considerable effort trying. What he did was something more valuable. He found former members who were willing, under varying degrees of cover, to describe what they had experienced, and he cross-referenced those accounts against each other and against what little documentary evidence was available. The picture that emerged from his reporting was of an organization that took itself with great seriousness, that maintained its rituals with remarkable consistency across generations, and that produced in its members a loyalty so deep that most of them would spend the rest of their lives acknowledging it only obliquely, if at all. Rosenbaum's 1977 Esquire piece made its biggest mark not because of the rituals it described, but because of the psychological portrait it drew. Skull and Bones, in his account, was an institution that deliberately selected men, and they were exclusively men for most of the society's history, who were already ambitious, already well-connected, already pointed toward public life, and then provided them with an experience of intimacy and mutual disclosure so intense that it became, for many of them, the most important relationship of their formative years. The society did not make its members powerful. It made its powerful members loyal to each other in a way that endured. By the time Rosenbaum returned to the subject for The Atlantic in 2000, the stakes of the story had shifted. George W. Bush, then running for the presidency, had been a member of Skull and Bones. So had John Kerry, the Democratic senator from Massachusetts, who would become Bush's opponent 4 years later. Rosenbaum's 2000 piece, written before anyone could have anticipated that particular electoral collision, explored what it meant that a single organization of 15 annual members had managed to produce two simultaneous contenders for the highest office in the country, and what the silence both men maintained about their membership said about the nature of the obligation they felt toward it. When the 2004 election arrived and both candidates were indeed Bonesmen, the question was put to them directly, on multiple occasions, by interviewers who understood its significance. Bush's response in an interview with Tim Russert on Meet the Press was that it was so secret we can't talk about it. Kerry's response was nearly identical in its studied brevity. He acknowledged the membership and said nothing more. This synchronized reticence, produced by two men who disagreed sharply about nearly everything else in American public life, was remarked upon at the time and has been remarked upon ever since as evidence of something, though what exactly it is evidence of remains a matter of interpretation. What the record shows clearly is that the election of 2004 was not an anomaly. It was a compression of something that had been happening more quietly for generations. The question of internal conflict within Skull and Bones, whether the society has ever been seriously divided, has ever broken against itself, has ever had a moment of public rupture, is one that the historical record addresses only partially. The most significant documented controversy in the society's modern history was the decision, in 1991, to admit women. This was not a smooth or unanimous transition. A group of alumni Bonesmen representing the old guard of the membership went to court to block the move, arguing that the character of the society was inseparable from its male exclusivity, that the intimacy the rituals were designed to produce depended on a homogeneity that coeducation would dissolve. They lost the legal fight, and women were admitted beginning with the class of 1992. The episode revealed that whatever solidarity Skull and Bones projected to the outside world, it was capable on the question of its own identity of producing a genuine and publicly visible schism. It also revealed something about the society's self-understanding that is easy to overlook. The alumni who filed the lawsuit were not arguing that Skull and Bones was merely a social club that happened to have a preference. They were arguing that its rituals had a specific function, that the function depended on a specific context, and that altering that context would damage the function irreparably. Whether or not one accepts their conclusion, the argument itself confirms that the society has always understood its rituals as purposive, as doing something specific to the people who undergo them, rather than as decorative tradition maintained out of sentiment alone. The question of what precisely they do and whether what they do constitutes an appropriate foundation for the career networks that have subsequently been built on them is the question that connects the society's internal life to its external influence, and it is a question that the documented history of Skull and Bones' reach into American institutions makes impossible to set aside. The influence can be traced through several overlapping networks that the Bones membership created across the 20th century. The first is the most obvious: direct occupancy of senior positions in government, the judiciary, and the intelligence community. The second is subtler and in some ways more pervasive: the role of Bones alumni in shaping the major institutions of American intellectual and cultural life, the think tanks, the foundations, the major law firms, and the editorial boards of newspapers and journals that have defined the terms of public debate. The third, least documented but most speculated about, is the possibility that the network operates not merely through who its members are, but through how they behave with each other. Whether Bones membership creates a pattern of mutual preference in hiring, in patronage, in the small daily decisions through which power actually flows. The American establishment of the mid-20th century, the cluster of law firms, banks, foundations, and policy institutions centered on New York and Washington that Walter Lippmann, the journalist and public intellectual, famously described as the natural governing class of a democratic republic, drew disproportionately from a small number of educational institutions and disproportionately within Yale from the handful of senior societies of which Skull and Bones was the most prestigious. This was not a secret. It was barely even a scandal. It was simply the way things worked, a self-reinforcing system in which social capital accumulated in particular institutional channels, and those channels produced the people who were trusted with consequential decisions about national and international affairs. Averell Harriman, one of the most influential American diplomats of the 20th century, a figure who helped shape the Marshall Plan, served as ambassador to the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and remained a presence in democratic foreign policy for decades, was a Bonesman. Robert Lovett, who served as Secretary of Defense under Truman and is widely credited, along with Dean Acheson, with constructing the architecture of the Cold War American state, was a Bonesman. John Kerry's membership, when he became Secretary of State under Barack Obama, meant that the Society's alumni had occupied America's chief diplomatic position in both Democratic and Republican administrations within recent memory. These are documented facts. The question they leave open, the question that the documented record cannot answer from the outside, is whether these men's shared membership in Skull and Bones shaped their policy decisions in any specific, traceable way, or whether the membership is simply a marker of a social class whose members would have found each other and helped each other regardless of any formal initiation. The honest answer is that no one knows. The honest answer is also that the question deserves to be asked with more rigor and less ideology than it usually receives. This is where the popular account tends to go wrong in one of two directions. Either it treats the documented concentration of Bones alumni in positions of power as self-evidently sinister, proof of a coordinated project whose goals are hidden from the public, or it treats the documented concentration as meaningless, the natural result of a selective institution producing high achievers who go on to achieve highly, nothing to see, nothing to ask. Both responses are intellectually insufficient. The former sees coordination, where the record shows network effects. The latter sees nothing, where the record shows a pattern that demands explanation. The explanation that seems most consistent with the available evidence is that skull and bones functions and has always functioned as what sociologists call a high-trust network, a group of people who share a specific, intense, and private experience, who emerge from that experience with unusually strong bonds of mutual recognition and mutual obligation, and who then move through the world in ways that systematically benefit other members of the network, through hiring, through endorsement, through the small preferential gestures that never appear in any public record but that accumulate over careers and generations into something that looks very much like coordinated advantage. This is not the same as a conspiracy. It does not require any meeting, any plan, any secret agenda, any agreed upon goal beyond the goal that was there at the beginning, mutual loyalty maintained across time. But it is also not nothing. A high-trust network that operates across the most consequential institutions of a democratic state and that recruits from a pool defined by inherited social position as much as by individual merit is a structural problem whether or not its members consciously intend it to be one. The problem is not malice. The problem is exclusivity compounded across generations, a mechanism that advantages some people before they have done anything to deserve the advantage, and that disadvantages others before they have done anything to deserve the disadvantage. That is the part of the skull and bones story that gets lost in the noise of the more dramatic allegations, the world government claims, the satanic ritual allegations, the bloodline theories, and it is, by a considerable margin, the part most strongly supported by the actual record. The dramatic allegations are worth examining seriously, precisely because they crowd out the more grounded critique, and in doing so, serve the interests of the people most invested in the subject never being examined seriously at all. When the public conversation about skull and bones is dominated by claims about Satanism, about skull worship, about a secret world government operating from a brownstone in New Haven, the result is not illumination. The result is that any serious question about the society's structural influence can be dismissed by association with those claims, and the dismissal is, in those cases, largely fair. The most outlandish allegations provide cover for the institution they purport to expose. So what are those allegations, precisely, and what does the record actually say about each of them? The first and most pervasive claim is the simplest, that Skull and Bones does not merely produce powerful people, but directs them, that the society maintains a coherent agenda across generations of membership, and that this agenda is served by the strategic placement of bonesmen in key institutions, not as a byproduct of shared social capital, but as a deliberate project of institutional capture. This claim, in its strong form, requires that the society functions as something like a hidden governing body, with continuity of purpose across changing membership, the ability to coordinate across diverse institutions simultaneously, and the willingness of members to subordinate their independent judgment and institutional obligations to the society's direction. The documented evidence does not support this strong form of the claim. What it supports is a weaker, but still significant version, that bonesmen have preferentially supported other bonesmen in career advancement, that the network has operated with a degree of internal solidarity that non-members rarely encounter from their own institutional affiliations, and that this solidarity has produced, cumulatively, a pattern of mutual benefit that looks from the outside like coordination, even when it may be nothing more than instinct. The instinct to trust someone who has shared an intimate experience with you, to give the benefit of the doubt to someone whose secrets you hold and who holds yours. The second major allegation, and the one that has attracted the most sustained scholarly attention, is the claim associated most strongly with Anthony Sutton, that Skull and Bones, through its membership, has deliberately funded and supported both sides of major political conflicts, communist and anti-communist, fascist and anti-fascist, in order to profit from the conflict itself and to maintain a position of influence regardless of which side prevails. Sutton developed this argument at length in his trilogy on Wall Street's relationships with the Bolshevik Revolution, Nazi Germany, and the rise of Franklin Roosevelt, and then applied it explicitly to Skull and Bones in his volume on the Order. Sutton's scholarship is a complicated case. His earlier historical work, particularly his research on American corporate investment in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s, contained genuine archival findings that mainstream historians were slow to engage with, partly because the conclusions were inconvenient, and partly because Sutton was working outside the institutional structures that confer academic legitimacy. His later work and his explicit application of the dual funding thesis to Skull and Bones relied more heavily on inference and pattern recognition than on direct documentary evidence of intentional coordination. The pattern he identified, Bones alumni appearing on both sides of major conflicts, is real. Whether the pattern reflects intentional strategy or simply the law of large numbers applied to a network that has produced so many senior figures across so many institutions is a question the evidence cannot definitively resolve. What the evidence can establish is that the network was real, that it operated across institutional boundaries in documented ways, and that the people who belonged to it were aware of their shared membership and drew on it. Whether that constitutes a conspiracy depends in large part on what one means by conspiracy, and here the word becomes an obstacle rather than a tool because it implies a degree of formal coordination, explicit planning, and unified intention that the record does not show, while simultaneously implying that the only alternative is the complete absence of coordination, which the record equally does not show. The third major category of allegation, and the one that requires the most careful handling because it intersects with a long tradition of hatred rather than merely a tradition of suspicion, is the claim that Skull and Bones is the instrument of a specific ethnic or religious elite that uses it to exercise hidden dominion over American society. This framing appears in several versions, and they are not all the same, though they all share a common defect. In some versions, the society is presented as the instrument of a WASP, Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment, that uses it to perpetuate its dominance against an imagined Jewish threat, a framing that is not anti-Semitic in itself, but that often functions as an alibi for anti-Semitic paranoia, locating all the power with one group precisely in order to deny it to another. In other versions, the society is absorbed into broader claims about Jewish banking families or Zionist networks, and Skull and Bones becomes one node in a larger conspiracy whose ultimate authors are identified by ethnicity or religion. Both versions are historically false and morally contemptible, and both versions do specific damage that goes beyond mere factual error. They are factually false because the documented membership of Skull and Bones includes people of varying backgrounds who have held sharply divergent political positions, because the society's documented influence operates through the mechanisms of class and institutional network, rather than through ethnic solidarity, and because the broader conspiracist frameworks into which these readings insert Skull and Bones have been debunked repeatedly by historians who have examined the underlying claims directly. They are morally contemptible because they redirect legitimate questions about concentrated power and institutional exclusivity into channels of ethnic and religious hatred, a redirection that has historically served to protect the actual mechanisms of power from scrutiny while mobilizing popular anger against people who have nothing to do with those mechanisms. The serious question, how does a small, private, oath-bound institution produce so many people who end up in positions of enormous public consequence, and what does that say about the relationship between private loyalty and public trust in a democratic society, is entirely legitimate. It does not require the anti-Semitic or ethno-religious framing. It is, if anything, weakened and obscured by that framing. And anyone who finds themselves drawn to the more dramatic versions of the Skull and Bones story should ask whether the drama is serving the truth or replacing it. This is the part of the popular story that tends to go most badly wrong, and it is worth pausing here to say plainly what the record actually shows, as opposed to what the most viral versions of the story claim. The record shows that Skull and Bones was founded by members of the Anglo-Protestant New England establishment in 1832, that it drew its membership predominantly from that establishment for most of its history, that it admitted its first black member in 1949 in the person of Levi Jackson, an event that was itself controversial within the membership, and that was not followed by a sustained effort to diversify the selection process, and that it remained a predominantly white, predominantly wealthy, predominantly male institution until the admission of women in 1992. The record does not show a society organized around ethnic or religious exclusion in the conspiratorial sense. It shows a society organized around class exclusion, which is a different thing and, in some ways, a more durable and less visible thing. The record shows that Bonesmen have held senior positions in government, intelligence, finance, law, and media in numbers far exceeding what one would expect from a group of 15 annual members drawn from a single university. It does not show that this concentration was the result of explicit coordination from within the tomb, but it does show that the network effects of shared membership were real and cumulative, that Bonesmen helped other Bonesmen in documented ways, and that the society understood itself as a mechanism for producing exactly this kind of sustained mutual advantage. The record shows that the rituals of the society were designed to create bonds of unusual intensity and durability through the exchange of intimate and compromising personal information, and that these bonds appear to have persisted across careers and decades in ways that ordinary professional friendships do not. It does not show that these bonds constituted an obligation to subordinate public duties to the society's interest, but it does raise a question, a serious, unresolved, and under-examined question about whether people who carry that kind of mutual knowledge about each other can fully separate their private loyalties from their public roles. None of this is secret. Most of it is documented. Most of it has been documented for decades. The reason it does not receive more serious public attention is partly that the more dramatic allegations crowd out the more grounded ones, and partly that the people most positioned to investigate the question seriously are often people whose careers have benefited from the same networks of institutional trust that Skull and Bones exemplifies, and who have reasons, not necessarily conscious ones, to find the question less interesting than it is. The stoniest silence in this story is not the silence the tomb enforces. It is the silence that surrounds a question that everyone with the resources to answer it has a personal stake in leaving unanswered. What would it mean to answer it? What would it require? It would require, at minimum, a willingness to treat the documented concentration of Bones alumni in sensitive positions not as a biographical curiosity, a fun fact about American presidents, but as a structural feature of American institutional life that deserves the same level of rigorous scrutiny that we apply to other structural features of that life, such as the influence of money in politics or the overrepresentation of particular law schools in the federal judiciary. It would require asking, plainly and without conspiracy theory framing, whether institutions that select their members through private criteria, bind them through shared secrets, and then release them into positions of public trust are compatible with the democratic premise that public power should be accountable and its exercise transparent. It would require, in other words, asking the question that Skull and Bones was designed, from its inception, to make difficult to ask. The suppression of the story of Skull and Bones has never been dramatic in the way that suppression is usually dramatized. No one has been killed for knowing too much, no journalist has disappeared, no congressional investigation has been quietly buried. The suppression has been of a quieter and more durable kind, the kind that operates through social pressure, professional discouragement, and the simple fact that the people best positioned to investigate the society are often the people with the most to lose from what the investigation might reveal. Rosenbaum described this dynamic with precision in his Atlantic piece, noting that the response his journalism had provoked from Bones alumni was not legal threat or outright denial, but a more refined form of discouragement. The suggestion, delivered through intermediaries in the right clubs and the right offices, that pursuing the story was eccentric, that the things that could be confirmed were not interesting, and that the things that were interesting could not be confirmed. This is a more sophisticated form of information control than censorship, and it is more effective in the long run because it does not create martyrs or generate the kind of defiant attention that legal suppression invites. It works instead by shaping the social and professional incentives of the people who might otherwise be curious, by making the story seem like the province of the unserious, and by ensuring that anyone who does pursue it seriously must do so at some cost to the relationships and credibility that journalism, particularly the kind of journalism that operates close to power, depends upon. Alexandra Robbins, who published a book-length investigation of Skull and Bones in 2002 under the title Secrets of the Tomb, documented similar pressures in her account of the research process. She found former members willing to speak, as Rosenbaum had, but she also found a consistent pattern of reluctance in people who had reason to know more than they were saying, a reluctance that could not be explained entirely by the oath of secrecy the society exacted from its members, since the oath had clearly not prevented all disclosure, but that seemed to reflect something more personal than obligation, a sense of loyalty so deeply internalized that breaking it felt like a violation of the self rather than merely a violation of a rule. This is precisely what the initiation ritual is designed to produce. An oath can be broken if the obligation it represents comes to seem less important than some competing obligation, to truth, to public interest, to the reporter sitting across the table. But loyalty that has been built into a person through the mechanism of shared vulnerability, through the experience of having disclosed the most private parts of oneself to a group of peers and having been received rather than rejected, operates at a different level. It is not a rule to be evaluated. It is a bond that has become part of how the person understands himself in relation to others, and severing it feels less like a principled decision and more like an amputation. The society itself has adapted to scrutiny over time, not by becoming more transparent, but by becoming slightly more comfortable with the existence of scrutiny, a strategic concession that has the effect of normalizing the society's presence in public life while leaving its actual workings as obscure as ever. The publication of Robbins' book, the renewed attention around the 2004 election, and the widespread circulation of partial accounts of the initiation ritual on early internet platforms in the late 1990s and early 2000s all created pressure that the society met not with outrage, but with studied indifference. Its members continued to decline comment. Its building continued to stand with its windowless lower floors facing the street. The number 322 continued to appear on its padlocks, answering nothing. The legal history around the Geronimo skull claim illustrates this posture clearly. When Harlan Geronimo and other descendants of the Apache leader filed a lawsuit in 2009 asserting that Skull and Bones had taken the skull from Fort Sill during the First World War, an act that, if true, would constitute a violation of federal laws protecting Native American remains and a desecration of a historical figure of immense cultural significance, the Society's response was quiet, procedural, and ultimately successful. The suit was dismissed without a finding on the underlying facts. The skull, real or theatrical, remained in the tomb. The question of what the Society actually holds in its reliquary of morbid objects remains, like most questions about the interior of that building, formally unanswered. What we can say with confidence is this: the institution has endured. In an era in which many of the social structures that defined 20th century American elite culture have frayed or collapsed, in which old-line Protestant establishment clubs have lost members, in which legacy admissions at Ivy League universities have faced legal challenges, in which the concept of a natural governing class has become politically unspeakable in a way it was not 2 generations ago, Skull and Bones has continued to tap 15 seniors every spring to induct them in the same building in the same Egyptian revival style, to extract from them the same intimate confessions, and to release them into a world that continues with some regularity to reward them with positions of unusual consequence. That persistence is not nothing. It is arguably the most interesting thing about the society. More interesting than any of the specific allegations. More interesting than any of the documented memberships. More interesting even than the unanswered question of what 322 really means. The persistence suggests that whatever Skull and Bones is doing, and whatever it is producing in the people who pass through it, it is producing something that those people find worth protecting. Worth protecting through oath, through silence, through the kind of loyalty that survives careers and presidential campaigns and Senate hearings and the ordinary wearing away of time. And this brings us back, inevitably, to the building on High Street and to the question it poses every day to anyone who chooses to stop and look at it rather than walk past. There is, in any society that calls itself democratic, a fundamental tension between the value of private association, the freedom to form bonds with chosen others on terms that you define, and the demands of public accountability. The requirement that power exercised in the name of the public be exercised transparently, subject to scrutiny and correction. Most private associations resolve this tension easily, because most private associations do not produce large numbers of people who then go on to run the intelligence services, shape foreign policy, sit on the Supreme Court, or occupy the Oval Office. Skull and Bones cannot resolve the tension easily, because the concentration of its alumni in positions of public trust is too great and too persistent to be treated as coincidental. The tension does not require a conspiracy to be real. It does not require any of the more dramatic allegations to be true. It requires only the documented facts. 15 people per year, selected in private, bound by shared secrets, networked across the most consequential institutions in American public life, and unwilling, institutionally, collectively, and with remarkable consistency across nearly 2 centuries, to say very much about what that shared experience actually entailed, or what, if anything, it committed them to. The people who find this troubling are not wrong to find it troubling, and they do not need to believe in world governments or satanic rituals to justify the trouble. The people who find it unremarkable are making a choice about what deserves scrutiny that is itself a political choice, whether or not they recognize it as one. Some researchers see in all of this the architecture of coordinated control, a hidden hand guiding American history toward ends that have never been publicly articulated or democratically approved. Others see nothing more than an unusually durable old boy network, a social club with grandiose self-mythology and excellent alumni relations, no more sinister in principle than any other private institution that benefits its members by making them known to each other. All of these descriptions contain some truth. None contains the whole of it. The whole of it is something the tomb on High Street is not giving up. It has held its silence for nearly 2 centuries now, through wars and depressions and revolutions in media and communications and public life, through the transformation of American society from something that took its elite structures for granted to something that increasingly does not, and it has held its silence through all of that without visible strain. The building does not shift. The padlocks do not open. The windows on the lower floors remain, as they have always remained, absent. Every spring, a new group of Yale seniors receives an invitation that most of them will never speak about in public, and they walk through a door that closes behind them, and they become members of something that has been meeting in that room, or rooms like it since 1832, and they carry whatever they experience there into the rest of their lives, and into the decisions, small and large, that they will make from positions that the rest of us depend upon them to make in our interest rather than their own. Whether they do, whether they can, Whether an institution built on private loyalty is ever fully compatible with public trust. These are not questions that Skull and Bones will answer for us. They are questions we have been leaving unasked for a very long time. If you want more buried histories like this one, subscribe. There is a new one every week.